Hello, hello, and welcome to episode 31 of Trails in the Pod. I'm Colin. That's Kevin.
Does the Blue Knight fuck?
Well, I think no, because if the Blue Knight fucked, then probably the Blue Knight would have already gotten it on with Tia, right? But we have no textual evidence to claim that there was any doll princess sex going on.
Good to know. Because today we're talking about the past and fiction for Trails in the Sky SC. The two novels, The Dull Knight and Gambler Jack, as well as the data crystals about the Liber Orc and the Aureole that we see in the latter portions of the game.
Yes, and I have to say, when I was reading through the data crystals, I don't know if it answers some of the questions that we had brought up when we were talking about the fall of the society and the use of the aureole, but it definitely would have provided us with some useful context that we should have known about.
Me, I thought it raises more questions than answers, and in some aspects, maybe contradicts or provides an unexpected perspective on information we got in the terminals.
Okay, well, why don't we start with the data crystals then? What are you thinking?
So, in brief, the perspective I got from the epilogue, and Colin, tell me if this is just a wrong perspective. The perspective I got was an active civil war between human factions. But in the crystals, Colin, what it seemed was an insurgency, a rebellion that's pretty small that fought against the sentient almost Aureole, sealed it in space. The rebels seemed to be the only ones who then lived on the ground.
I don't think I got the impression that there was a civil war between human beings when I was going through the epilogue. What I got the impression of, and granted, I didn't read all of the terminals that were there, maybe you did, but the impression that I got was that there was some sort of a disaster in which the government was trying to respond to by doing more martial law type stuff, by clamping things down, by regulating things, because these robots were going around killing everybody or something to that effect. That's why we see technology with very violent weaponry walking around the streets and we see no people. But to me, that just indicates that there was a ultimately failed response to a disaster rather than a civil war between humans.
There was more than just one side of humans involved in what was ever going on. Like there was active involvement in something by the anti-Celeste faction.
Yeah, but and we even see a little bit of that in the data crystals when she mentions that there's disagreement about what to do with the aureole. We also see that sometimes the aureole gets to people, and especially like it gains. So the entire point of the data crystals, which I think is a really interesting part, is that it's not necessarily such the point that people abuse the aureole, though they did. It's more that the aureole, quote unquote, gained autonomy. It almost seems like it gained sentience. It had agency in and of itself, and it had its own goals. It acted in self-defense by sending reverie robots against those who were rebelling against it, seeking out those who it deemed to be in rebellion against it. And we saw in one case how it managed to kind of convert somebody back to following the Aureole who was initially part of the rebellion.
Data crystals, to me, gave the implication it was Celeste versus the Aureole as the ultimate figure, leader, whatever, on the other side. The terminals in the Auric gave the impression that human government authorities, whatever you want to call it, whatever complexity, however aware they were a significant factor in some degree. And we do not get that impression for the most part in the crystals. It's the Aureole and Celeste.
Maybe I just missed something, but I don't see a pro Aureole faction that is operating on its own free will. Even in the epilogue, I did not see that.
We do see mentions of a human government of sorts.
Yes, we know that
Were
there's a
they,
government, but
yes.
that government seems to have been acting against the Aureole once the Aureole went off haywire and caused a disaster.
Oh, so my impression was that Celeste was rebelling against the Aureole, and the human government was working with or working under the Aureole.
That's what we had discussed, but I don't think the evidence bears that out.
Is it humans versus Aureole at the end then?
It's a small minority of humans that managed to recognize early on that they should not get involved with the Aureole.
Who they've gone outside.
What's interesting to me about that whole, you're saying going outside, maybe you mean like going outside the system, but quite literally they go outside the city, right? They go to this primal forest underneath. But it's also implied that setting up their insurgency in the towers and in Annenberg, I mean, it takes time. And they have to hide it from the Aureole, which means that they're going back and forth, to act like things are normal and then coming back down there, which implies the people on Libra Arc had some knowledge of the world down below and some expertise of going down there. I'm guessing for resource extraction, maybe to get food. But I think that that's interesting. That it's showing that it's not like this was a isolated bubble of a city, but there was connection between above and below.
Did the developers have in mind when talking or creating the Aureole and what it did, what happened to it? It's almost like a sci-fi AI.
Yeah, the first thing that comes to my mind are the Rachni in Mass Effect, which clearly this was made before Mass Effect, so it's not the same thing. But it's like we have this centralized authority figure that is able to operate upon the minds of a large portion of the population to get to bend their will.
But what it thought was a good cause to make them happy. And then this raises a question. Was the Aureole, did it, quote, go rogue? Or was it doing what Ideos wanted to make the citizens happy, to make humans happy?
It seems to me that the evidence for the data crystals implies that it went rogue because they had been using the Aureole before, and yet that was a gift provided by Idios. They're taking advantage of its gifts, but then something changes, and that's when things start to go off the rails, and people are falling into dreams and changing their body chemistry in order to feel happy. It's as if something within this gift from Idios broke.
The goddess allow one of her gifts. Why so easily corruptible?
We don't know. That's one of the big mysteries of the series. This kind of brings up a point that I had made in a couple of episodes back. There's this concept of the Great Collapse, in which this is part of it. I've written in our Google Doc that I'm kind of iffy about it, and we should talk about why I feel a little bit iffy about it. But if you look on the wiki, there are three. Don't look on the wiki because it's spoilers for you, but there are three known cases of something going haywire with the Septarian, all happening at around the same time. And this is being implied to be part of the Great Collapse. And what causes these Septarians to go haywire, we don't know.
Outside stimulus, then,
Well, we
that
don't know.
corrupted.
Well, all we know is that things went wrong. We don't know why they went wrong. We don't know what Idios did. We don't even know. So, like, it's told to us that Idios gifted these Septarians. The only person that we know of that has had one-to-one conversations with Idios is Ragnar the Dragon. And we know nothing about the nature of that relationship. We know nothing about anything, really, about Idios.
I wonder how certain are we she is a force for good?
We're not certain at all. The only certainty that we have, or the only idea that we can have, she entrusted Ragnar with observing something for however many years, 5,000 years, something like this. And Ragnar does not appear to be a bad guy. Also, whatever task Idios had granted to Ragnar is now over, which is why he is able to do things.
You had a question. Did Weissman somehow get access to these crystals? I want to change it a tiny bit and ask you, what do you think Celeste would think about Weissman's plan?
Oh, I think she would very obviously be against Weissman's plan. I mean, she ends the thing with saying, or starts it, somewhere in there she writes, I am writing this so that people do not reactivate the Aureole. If you are going to, please don't do it.
But what about the conditions, the two ends, the end in fire and ice, to be poetic, that Weissman sees as the inevitable future? Would she agree with his diagnosis?
I don't think so. I mean, we have no evidence in this text to show that she's thinking about things in those terms. What we have is there was a disaster. We have averted it. We've sealed it away. We don't know what our successors are going to do. So I'm keeping this as a stopgap. But there's no philosophical reflections on the inevitability of progress leading to war or anything like that.
Was it by choice, do you think, or by necessity that she forcibly transitioned however many civilians from a euphoric sci-fi wish granting setting to what seems to have been early agricultural subsistence lifestyles?
I mean, I would say that it's necessity in the fact that something went wrong and they needed to seal the Aureole away. And the only way to do that was to seal the Libra Arc away. And then if you want people to live, you got to get them off. You got to get them out of there. So that I don't think that any of that was preordained, but it seems like a natural course of action once Celeste decided that she needed to fix the problem. One thing that I'm curious about is that so the Great Collapse is connected both with the Septarians going haywire and the loss of technology in society. Right? We have the ancient Sumerians that we see in the Libra arc that are like technologically sophisticated, and then the Great Collapse happens and we lose the technology, and now we're in the throes of gaining that technology back again. Celeste and her crew come down to Liberl and set up facilities in Annenberg and in the Four Towers and know how to use them, set them up, and use them successfully in order to seal away the Aureole. My question, did they only bring like a little bit of their technology down, all that was necessary to make that work, and then only that? Did something else happen that caused us to lose access to technology? I mean, clearly, like, we talked a little bit about this. I'm fairly certain that Annenberg is the final dungeon of FC, which means that it's very much underground, it's hidden. Also, we see the technology on the top of the towers, but nobody knows how it works. So the knowledge of how that works is lost. But also, people have built on top of these structures, which implies that people stopped accessing them. So is it just a matter of we knew the technology was there, we didn't want to fuck with it, and therefore we have lost technology? Or why is there this loss of technology?
I don't know. And this raises another point about numbers and who is involved. There's vague, very vague cultural folk memories that these Sumerians before the collapse were much more technologically advanced.
Yeah.
If it seems that the people who settled came from the Ark, who had direct experience with all these specifics, why aren't there more, I guess, certain or more definite stories about these paradise? Why aren't there more stories about the paradise they had in the clouds?
That's an interesting point. It might be that there are and we just don't know about them, but that is something ripe for myth, right? Like you'd expect something like that to be in the scriptures of the Church of Idios. And maybe it is. It's not like we have a copy of the scriptures in front of us, but I nobody has talked about it so far.
Everything that we are told leads us to, I think, the reasonable conclusion that no specifics about the Ark, about life in the Ark, have survived.
So also what's interesting to me thinking about this even more is that so in order for that to happen, that means that the survivors of the Libra arc had to pretty much intentionally decide to not talk about it. Otherwise, it wouldn't have gotten lost for a while. I mean, there's certainly enough continuity between the founding of Liberl and now because it's still the same royal family with a genetic code strong enough that we can fool the computer on the Libra arc into thinking that Chloe is Celeste. There's a strong connection there in between in terms of continuation of family, which would be a perfect vehicle to keep that memory alive, especially for something as important as making sure that nobody brings it back. And the reason why we know that that is a goal is that Celeste records these data crystals and tells us, don't bring the Aureole back. But she records them in a format that is only possible to be read by the technologically advanced. So is this a thing where they throw away their technology knowing that eventually it'll come back? And then when it comes back, they have these data crystals ready for people to read?
Maybe why not also have even passed down from monarch to heir in an oral or a written only for them tradition mythology version, maybe cliff notes, whatever, to one, say don't do that, and two, if it was data crystals to eventually be able to be read again, that kind of implies, and tell me if you think I'm wrong, there's only one path for development to take of essentially information storage and retrieval. That orbal technology is the only real way forward, but we know that's not the case.
It certainly implies a that language stays relatively static because it's readable. It's not implied that there is translation going on. It's implied that reconstruction is happening because bits are blocked off, right? And it also, yes, it implies that technology has to develop in the same way. And I'm trying to think about this now. And like computers, right? They operate on very specific mechanisms, zeros and ones. We have not found another way to do computers other than that. Doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but as a society, we love thinking about computers, and there is no other way to run a computer other than ultimately binary code.
Let me problematize that. I think it's less binary as an analogy and more document formatting. Some computers can't read documents from 25, 30, 35 years ago. How do they know that whatever way that information is stored and retrieved would essentially be forwards and backwards compatible?
I know that you're breaking that up as a problem. To me, that is part of the reason why I think I'm right. And the reason why we can't read documents from like WordPerfect back in the day is because file formats have changed and the programs that we use to read those files have changed. If you open up those files in Notepad, what you get is basically a bunch of formatting code, and then the original document is also in there. And you can change that file in order to fit the specifications of a .docx or an ODT or something like that. You are able to convert, or you are able to create software that is able to access these legacy file formats. This is a huge issue in digital preservation. I find it fascinating. And all of that is possible because ultimately everything comes down to zero and ones. And we're just thinking of different ways to abstract those instructions and to reinterpret those instructions so that we can access it on the human level, which I think is the same thing
Okay,
that's going on with these data crystals.
that makes sense. And then I have a question for you about humanity and where they were all doing it before this. Eidos gave the Septarians two people.
Yeah.
So to me, that implies there were people before the orcs.
You say the arcs. We only know of one arc, and that's only over Liberl. So places like Erebonia, Calvert, Crossbell, that might have their own septarians, there are still going to be people living there that are not living on floating cities.
Okay. Were people in Liberal on the ground before Idios gave them the Aureole? Where were they in relation to the ground, the sky? Was this their first time in Liberal on the soil when after Celeste did her thing?
I mean, these are questions that I don't think that we can answer with the information that we have. What we do know
Okay.
is that the forest appears to be primal according to Celeste. So that could imply never been touched, could also imply hasn't been touched for a long time. We also have to presuppose that people were living somewhere in order to be given the Libra arc. It could be that they lived someplace else and then the Libra arc happened and it was floating over Liberl, which hadn't been settled, or it could be the indigenous population that lived in Liberl that was then raised up. The fact is, we simply do not know.
So shall we turn to stuff that we can have more certainty about? Let's start with the Dull Knight.
What did you think of the Dawn Knight?
To me, it felt like very different not just in tone but style from Gambler Jack. The Dull Knight felt like a fairy tale, like a folk story, like
Mhm.
something that would have been repeated before it was written down. Gambler Jack felt like something that was created for the written word.
Interesting. That's not the take that I got. So, why do you think that? What about the Dull Knight makes it seem like it's an oral tradition first that was later written down?
It feels like it has a lot of, I don't want to say stereotypical or generic, but say archetypes or familiar beats that we see a story more than a novel.
I mean, doesn't that just sound like children's literature in general? And that's not oral tradition. It's just people writing simple stories with simple themes.
Yes, in
And we know,
some,
by the way, that this is read as children's literature because Kevin read it out to a bunch of kids.
but also a lot of children's literature was transcribed by folklorists in the early and middle 1800s.
When you're talking about myth, like things that were founded in myth, yeah. But when you're talking about, I don't know, Tony DePaula that you're reading out to a first grade class, no, it wasn't. Yeah, but also I don't think that it's necessarily that important. What's important here, I think, is the emphasis placed on puppets. And I gotta be honest with you, Kev. My mind is abuzz with theories about how the Dull Knight is related to the series, but all of the evidence I have for it comes from games Trails from Zero onwards. So I don't want to talk about them. But the idea of dolls and how they can be used and how they can even be verging on autonomous at times is something that pops up again and again. At the end of the Dull Night, we hear mention of the 13 factories, right? It's just like one line, but boom, there's the 13 factories. Yet, all over these Ouroboros facilities that we've been running around in, we have seen that name pop up. And these are places that are technologically advanced, right? Presumably, that's also how these automatons are being constructed and provided. We see already that through line, and I guess what I'm trying to allude to is that there's even more of that as we go down the line.
What can we say about the story and its connection to FC and SC from the knowledge of only having played FC and SC, aka from my perspective? I think we can do a lot. Dolls, Rent's parents, the recurring Joshua doll connection, the dream, the fighting, and so forth in the latter part of the game. I think there's a lot that we can say that can be said. We got Ren's parents, which are explicitly linked with doll imagery and vocabulary a number of times.
On top of that, let's not forget Ren and Pater Mater. Not Pater Mater, but Pater Mater. She has control of this doll. I think it's even referred to as a doll, but certainly it's a type of automaton that is linked to her, but obeys orders. Ren is the one controlling it like a puppeteer.
So why include the story into SC?
That's a good question. I was telling you before we aired that I don't think that you can really draw a connection between the novels and the themes of the games. Like, for example, take Cornelia and FC. I don't really see a connection there thematically. There is a large prevalence of dolls in this game, showing people being controlled versus perhaps controlling yourself, right? That seems to be the message that we're trying to get at with Joshua regaining self autonomy, with Estelle's appeals to Ren. It's not quite a one to one because while both of them are kind of like being manipulated by Weissman, Ren is also a puppeteer in her own right with her parents and with Pater Mater and all of this stuff. I maybe it invites us to think about autonomy, which then also links into what it means for the Aureole to be autonomous. But I'm not sure how much we can really push that.
First, I would say that we can talk about, if not themes, then definite pertinence with novels. You said you couldn't with Cornelia. Cornelia shows us the church as an effective clandestine institution with agents of their own waging a secret war. We get more hints of that with Kevin, and especially with Kevin's actions killing Weissman at the end of SC. So we're primed to think of the church in this way through Cornelia.
Sure. Are we primed to think of anything in a different way by the Dull Knight?
Well, that will depend on the third and games hereafter.
Well, and see, and that is why I am pushing back against this idea of it being linked to the game that we're playing now. Because the
Okay.
Dull Knight does prepare us for certain events that happen in Zero and onwards. That's 2 games away. We could have had this in Trailers the Third, and it would have been fine. So long as we have these novels before the games in which their context is really helpful. I mean, you just pointed out with Cornelia, we mostly get the when we first talked about it, we were like trying to find ways for it to be relevant. And then we got to SC and we see Kevin and all of this stuff, and all of a sudden Cornelia makes a whole lot of sense. But it's only in the next game that it actually makes sense.
I'll concede on this point. Gambler Jack tonally could not be more different from the Dull Knight.
Correct. This is more of a exploration of the gritty underbelly of Calvert in the Eastern Quarter, which is where we see the meeting of East and West. But the plot of this is basically you have Jack, who had won a poker game against a guy named King. It was a high stakes poker game. The loser died. And then years later, that guy's daughter, Hale, comes to take revenge on Jack. It turns into kind of an exploration of the ruthless nature of the underworld in Calvert, right? We see Enrique kind of poison Hale when she's a kid in order to get King to take up this poker game. And then King has to kill himself in order to save his own daughter. Also, that Enrique's gang can grow.
Almost a film noir-ish setting. We see
Yeah.
a femme fatale walk in, the slightly dissolute male main character with a heart of gold who does right in the end and reforms himself.
Now, the question will be, is this fiction or is this biography?
To me, it screams biography, or at the very least, a lightly fictionalized retelling.
Well, I don't want to give too much away. However, I want to say two things that I think is really going to piss you off. This book leads to something that happens in Trails the Third. And this book leads to something that happens in Kuro no Kiseki.
Okay, so it leads to something I'll discover in the coming months, one, and it leads to something I'll discover in about 2.5 years.
Yeah, probably.
One question I have, and this is a bit of a vague one, does Jack's heroic turn kind of strip Holly of agency? What does she do in the last part that's active and independent? Jack is the one who deduces what happens. Jack is the one who uses King's cheating method for cards. Jack is the one who asks for Paula her safe passage as his prize. Jack is the one who precipitates the showdown between Enrique and Juan.
It seems to me that this is the wrong question to ask, and let me explain why. Hale's agency comes about by bringing together this revenge match. Right? Her agency is bringing that about. Once we enter the match format, both players have agency. They're both playing. So by asking the question, does Hale lose agency here? That's basically asking, does a loser not have agency? And we see that the game is very evenly matched, but at this final round, she gets cocky, right? She makes this decision to go all in, and Jack then pulls out one last trick in order to win that battle. I don't see this as Holly not having any agency and Jack having all of the agency. I see it as two agents competing and one agent winning.
It's just, and I'm struggling with the words to explain my interpretation, what I feel. It just, I had this subconscious feeling, I guess you would call it, while reading it, that Jack felt like like the only dynamic character. And Holly felt very static, but she is the clear deuteragonist of the story. So it felt odd to have this character, to me, not really grow or change.
I see this completely differently from you. To me, Jack is the static one. He is how he was at the beginning. We've seen more information, but it's not like he's changed as a character. Hale has. Hale changes from being very revenge driven to having her world turned upside down and then having to deal with the fact that she has been saved by the man who she has hated for the past 3 years. That is dynamism to me.
Well, to me, in the end, we see Jack is still drinking towards new, but he's not this alcoholic that he was. He has a better outlook on life.
I
He's
mean,
changed.
how else do you describe an alcoholic than somebody who starts at 12?
But the text tells us directly it is a very different atmosphere. He's not drinking as much, not as heavily.
Okay, well, maybe he's changed a little bit, but so is Holly. Let me ask you a question. So we now read, I'm not going to count the data crystals, but we've read now three novels from this series. We've read Cornelia, The Dull Knight, and Gambler Jack. How would you rate them?
Gambler Jack is the favorite. It feels the most modern, the most accessible. Very close second is Cornelia. I like the subterfuge, the hidden war, that this church is not entirely benevolent is the wrong word, but pacifistic or reactive. What say you? They are doing what they can, what they will in this war in the shadows. The Dull Knight felt a bit too removed for me to really appreciate it. I still think it felt like a fairy tale, like a folk story, and I'm just not that fond.
I mean, I agree that it reads like a fairy tale. I was just arguing with you that I don't think that means that it was rooted in oral tradition. I think I would agree with you that Gambler Jack is at the top. I really like gritty atmosphere, underworld crime, that kind of stuff. But I think I have to put The Dull Knight after that. I found it to be a very engaging read when I read it today. You know, I wanted to see the twists and turns. There's some stuff there that like triggers memories of other stuff in the game. So I mean, those connections are part of the experience. It's part of why they're there. So I want to keep them in mind as well. And I don't know, just as a literary piece, I thought that it was very enjoyable. Whereas with Cornelia, I don't know. I feel like if I go back to it, I can't think of the moment to moment anymore. It doesn't strike me as all that memorable. I obviously remember Ein Selnate. I remember the main character, but I also don't remember the main character doing much. If we want to talk about not having agency, the main character of Cornelia is just being saved the whole time.
He is very much an observer escort quest almost.
Yeah, and I remember when I first started collecting the books in FC, I tried to read them, and I found it kind of hard to follow. And I don't find them hard to follow now, obviously, and part of that is just because now we can just read them like normal as opposed to then waiting 2 hours to get to the next book and stuff like that.
So I think that's a wrap on Trails in the Sky SC.
Well, so our good friend Chua has tweeted us that there is a manga series starring Luva. I'm wondering, Kevin, would you be interested in reading that? And we're not going to record that episode now because I'm leaving for, but we can read that and have that be our episode that we start in February with.
That's almost a wrap on Trails in the Sky SC. We've got one more episode, the manga series that Colin just talked about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very curious to see it, and Chua seems really zazzed by it. I did see some comments on it, and I feel like it's going to ruin some things from Trails to Third for you, but that's okay. I'm looking forward to it. But with that, ladies and gentlemen, you will be receiving this episode like second week of January, something like that. It's currently December 20th, the day that we are recording this. We've recorded a lot of stuff in advance. It is time for us to take a break. But we got holiday travel to do. We got some time to relax. We play some other video games, read some other books, and then come back in February refreshed with a little bit of Trails in the Sky SC, and then hitting it off with Trails the Third.
Well, I think I'm in need of a break less than Colin. I've only played two games. If I could, I would start Trails the Third prologue tonight. Colin not only replayed two games, Colin has played Hajimari and Kuro within a very, very short succession. And from what I understand, those are much longer than FC and SC.
Yeah, when I played through Hajimari, I thought I was close to beating it at 9 p.m., and I beat it at 3 a.m. They are long games, good games. And also, one thing that I wanted to say before I forget is that I didn't think that Hajimari's plot was very good because of how the end villain exists, like what that end villain is. Reading the data crystals and looking at how the Aureole gains autonomy kind of flicks something in my head, and now Hajimari is a lot more interesting to me. So I just want to flag that.
I'm Kevin. That's Colin. See you for the manga and then the third.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Bye bye.